In 1965, nearly every motorcycle sold in America was built in either Milwaukee or Birmingham. Heavy. Loud. Built by hand in factories that had been running since before the war. These weren't just machines, they were a way of life. By 1980, that world was gone. This wasn't just competition. This was a complete shift in power. After World War II, motorcycles in America meant something very specific. They were heavy, they were loud, and they were mechanical. You did not buy a motorcycle unless you were willing to get your hands dirty. That was just understood. If you wanted speed, you bought British, Triumph, BSA, Norton. These were names that had dominated racing for decades. If you wanted American iron, you bought heavyweight cruisers built in Milwaukee, machines that rumbled and announced themselves a block away. For tens of thousands of Americans, motorcycles were not recreation. They were transportation, the affordable way to get to work, the practical choice for young families who could not yet afford a car. A motorcycle was not just a machine, it was a promise. Built by your neighbor, serviced by someone who knew your name, repaired with tools you could buy at the hardware store. When it leaked oil in your driveway, that was part of the deal. You put down cardboard, you tightened the bolts. You accepted it. Because that is what motorcycles did. They leaked. They vibrated. They needed constant attention. And if you rode one, you understood that. You wore it like a badge. This was the culture. This was the identity. This was what it meant to be a motorcyclist in America. But by the mid-1960s, cracks were starting to show. The engineering methods had not changed much since the 1940s. The tools were the same. The assembly processes were the same. The tolerances were the same. British factories were still building motorcycles the way they had built them in 1935. By hand. With craftsmanship. With pride in the individuality of each machine. American manufacturers were focused on their core identity. Big engines. Big sound. Big presence. Reliability was not really the point. Character was. If your bike left a puddle, you joked about it with other riders. If it needed constant adjustment, you learned to adjust it. If something broke, you learned to fix it. That was part of the romance, part of the bond between rider and machine. But something else was changing in America. Car ownership was rising. Highways were expanding, suburbs were growing, and motorcycles were slowly shifting from necessity to choice. The generation that had ridden motorcycles because they had to was aging out, and a new generation of riders was asking different questions. They did not grow up in the Depression. They did not learn mechanical skills out of necessity. They had other options, and they were starting to wonder, why does it have to be this hard? Questions the industry was not ready to answer. While America was focused inward, Japan was rebuilding. The war had destroyed their industrial capacity, their cities, their economy. But what they built in its place was different. After the war, American consultants came to Japan. They taught quality control methods, statistical process control, and continuous improvement systems. The Japanese did not just adopt these ideas, they perfected them. Precision engineering became a national priority. Quality control systems became standard across industries. Mass production was designed around consistency, not just speed. This was not just about motorcycles. The Japanese government had identified manufacturing exports as their path forward. It was their economic survival strategy. And motorcycles were small enough, light enough, and popular enough to be the testing ground. They started small. 50 cubic centimeter motors attached to bicycles, 100 cubic centimeter commuter bikes. Machines designed for crowded cities and narrow streets where cars could not fit. Cheap. Simple. Reliable. Nothing that would threaten the American or British manufacturers, at least that was what everyone thought. But their engineers were studying something else. The inline-four engine design had 4 cylinders, overhead cams, and high revving performance. It was more sophisticated than the twins and singles that dominated the market. Inline-four British manufacturers had built inline-fours for racing. They were exclusive machines, expensive, and produced in limited quantities. Exclusive. The Japanese asked a different question. What if we could mass produce them? What if we could make them affordable? What if we could make them reliable? And in the late 1960s, everything changed. Honda released the CB750. Kawasaki followed with the Mach 3. Yamaha and Suzuki joined in. Suddenly, four-cylinder performance was not exotic anymore. It was available at your local dealer for a price that working people could actually afford. Affordable. Your father's generation accepted that starting a motorcycle meant kicking until your leg went numb. Kicked cold mornings meant you kicked 20 times, 30 times. You flooded it, you cleared it, and you kicked again. Cold mornings, that was normal. But by 1970, a different question was being asked. What if it did not have to be that way? Different electric starters. Push a button, the bike starts every time. Electric starters. Oil-tight engines, no cardboard in the driveway, no constant top-ups, no mess. Oil-tight, smooth, predictable power delivery, no vibration shaking your fillings loose at highway speed. Smooth, reliable electrics, lights that actually worked, turn signals that did not short out in the rain. Reliable. And the price? Often less than what you would pay for the British or American equivalent price. For the first time. You did not need to be a mechanic to be a rider. First time, you did not need to know how to set points. You did not need to understand carburetor jetting. Mechanic. You didn't need a garage full of tools, you just needed to want to ride. The Japanese manufacturers were selling something the industry had never really offered before. Convenience, dependability, freedom from constant maintenance. And American riders responded. The numbers told the story. 1965, Japanese manufacturers held less than 10% of the American market. 1970, they held 35%. 1975, they held more than 60%. By 1980, over 85%. This wasn't a trend. This was a revolution. Dealerships that had sold British bikes for 20 years started going out of business. American manufacturers watched their market share collapse. And the riders, they voted with their wallets. At first, the reaction was dismissal. Small bikes, lightweight machines, nothing that would threaten the real motorcycle market. The serious riders, the real enthusiasts, they would never abandon proper motorcycles for these Japanese toys. Or so the thinking went. But that dismissal was built on something deeper. Pride. Generational knowledge. Decades of manufacturing tradition. The British had been building motorcycles since the 1890s. They had dominated racing. They had supplied motorcycles to armies in 2 world wars. They had created the cafe racer culture. American manufacturers had their own legacy. They had defined what a motorcycle sounded like, what it felt like, what it meant. The idea that consumers would choose reliability over character seemed impossible. These were machines with soul, with history, with identity. Japanese bikes were appliances. Reliable, sure, but soulless. Mass-produced. Interchangeable. That's what they told themselves. The British manufacturers had survived 2 world wars. They had built machines for the military, for racing, for generations of riders who demanded performance above all else. Adaptation would mean admitting that everything they had built their reputation on might not be enough anymore. It would mean retooling factories, retraining workers, investing in new manufacturing systems. It would mean borrowed money. Risk. Change. And change was expensive. By the time the threat was clear, the market had already shifted. BSA merged with Triumph, trying to survive through consolidation. It did not work. Norton collapsed. It was bought, and it collapsed again. Factories that had run for 50 years began to close. Brands that had defined motorcycling for generations disappeared. By 1975, British motorcycle manufacturing was essentially finished. This was not about who built a better product. This was about who understood what riders actually wanted. And what riders wanted had changed. But the machines were only part of the story. For decades, if you rode a motorcycle in America, people knew what that meant. They knew what you wore. Leather jacket. Boots. Maybe a club patch. They knew what you sounded like. That deep rumble, That mechanical clatter, they knew what you stood for. Freedom, rebellion, independence, a little danger. And then, almost overnight, none of that was certain anymore. The Japanese manufacturers did not just sell motorcycles, they sold a different idea of who a motorcyclist could be. Their advertising did not show outlaws or rebels. It showed normal people, families, commuters, weekend adventurers. The famous Honda campaign said it outright. You meet the nicest people on a Honda. That was not an accident, that was strategy. Motorcycling did not have to be a lifestyle. It could just be transportation, recreation, a hobby. You did not need leather and oil stains. You did not need to know how to rebuild a carburetor. You did not need to be part of the culture. You could be a commuter, a weekend rider, a father taking his son for a ride on Sunday morning. The culture that had defined American motorcycling for 30 years was suddenly just one option among many. And for riders who had grown up in that world, that felt like losing something that could not be replaced. This was not just about market share or factory closures, this was about identity. The younger riders did not care. They had never had to kickstart a bike in the rain. They had never rebuilt an engine in their driveway. They did not have nostalgia for oil leaks and unreliability. They just wanted to ride. But the older generation, the ones who had built their identity around being the person who could fix anything, the ones who wore their mechanical knowledge like a badge of honor, watched the culture change and did not recognize it anymore. Sport bikes replaced cruisers as the best-selling category. Fairings and inline-fours replaced naked bikes and twins. The sound changed. The look changed. The entire aesthetic changed. Motorcycling was becoming something different. By the early 1980s, the transformation was complete. British motorcycle manufacturing had collapsed. Most of the legendary brands were gone or survived only as names owned by someone else. Triumph, Norton, BSA, Vincent, all gone. American manufacturers faced a choice: adapt or disappear. Some tried to compete on engineering, build better machines, match the Japanese on reliability. It didn't work. The gap was too wide. The investment required was too large. Others doubled down on identity, on heritage, on the idea that a motorcycle was more than just transportation. That worked better. The Japanese inline-four became the global standard. Oil leaks became unacceptable. Electric starters became expected. Reliability became the baseline. The engineering philosophy that had dominated for decades was now history. This was globalization before anyone called it that. The best manufacturing systems were winning. The old ways were replaced. American manufacturing towns that had built motorcycles for generations moved on to other industries. British factory towns faced unemployment and decay. The supply chains collapsed. The skilled workers retired or found other jobs. An entire ecosystem disappeared. But here's what didn't change: the reason people rode in the first place. Freedom. Identity. The feeling of movement without barriers. Wind. Speed. The road ahead. That survived. It always does. American motorcycling didn't end in 1980. It evolved. Brands that survived learned to compete on culture and heritage instead of just engineering. Harley-Davidson almost went bankrupt, but they figured out they weren't selling motorcycles. They were selling identity, Americana, a lifestyle, and that you can't mass produce in Japan. Riders learned to appreciate both worlds, the romance of the old bikes and the reliability of the new ones. Vintage British bikes became collectibles. Restoration became an art form. The bikes that had been dismissed as obsolete became valuable precisely because they represented a lost era. The industry that emerged was different, more global, more diverse, more focused on the rider experience than the mechanical mystique. But it was also richer. More options, more styles, more ways to be a motorcyclist. You could ride a vintage Triumph and wrench on it every weekend, or you could ride a modern Japanese bike and never think about maintenance. Both were valid. Both were respected. It wasn't the end of American motorcycling. It was the beginning of a new chapter. The motorcycles changed, the factories changed, the riders changed, the culture changed, but the reason people rode, that never changed at all.